Got a quick lens video for you today, and I'm looking at the Ẓigma 12 to 24mm. I'll just put a few of the key features on the screen for you so you can have a look at that if you want to. This is version number 2, the version number 1 that has a sort of crinkle effect finish. We'll do a quick physical tour of the lens now, and you'll notice that you do get a lens cap with this. The cover at the front, which sits over the hood, that is made out of metal. You'll notice that it does have a couple of felt rings on the inside that just helps grip onto the hood. I'll talk about that cover now briefly. This has an 82mm thread on it, and you also get that lens cap with it. And the reason for that is, I assume, that it can give you at least some filter coverage at some focal lengths, but you will get vignetting, quite significant vignette on full frame. It's only really by 24mm that you can use it with a filter screwed into that. APS-C is a bit different, obviously, due to the crop factor. So around about 16-17mm, there's no obvious effects of having a filter on there. The hood is built in and there is no obvious way to remove that. That's also made out of metal as well. Quickly show you on the barrel, not too much to see, but we do have the autofocus manual focus switch on the side. Focus ring is mechanically coupled, so you get a pretty good feedback off of that. I would describe the build quality on this as mid-range. It's definitely not pro level, but it's notably better than something like a kit lens, definitely better quality plastics. You will notice that when you start to zoom in and out that the elements do move backwards and forwards. I'll put the apertures on screen now with the focal length, and I'll just show you the autofocus operation. Focus motor on this is quiet and it's moderately quick, certainly quick enough for a lens of this type. Done a few tests now, so we'll start off with the vignette and distortion. There is a bit of barrel distortion, but it's not particularly bad considering we're at 12mm. Fair amount of vignetting, but you'll notice that does disappear when you stop the lens down. When you get to the sort of 16mm mark, there's only a smaller amount of distortion. At 24mm, that turns into pincushion and the vignette is less pronounced at that focal length. And here's a quick shot of the 12mm corrected in software. 12 to 24mm doesn't sound like a huge zoom range, but it is actually quite significant. Here's a few shots demonstrating the three focal lengths, 12, 16 and 24mm, and there's a big difference between each of these focal lengths. Few shots outside for you on the resolution, just at the three main focal lengths. You notice at 12mm in the middle, wide open, it's pretty good actually. There's a slight improvement stopping down, but it's not bad at all. The situation does change quite quickly though once you start looking at the edges and corners. There is quite a lot of blur there in the corner. Once you start going down to f13, then you're going to start to see some decent improvements. It's even a touch better at f16, although you will lose a little bit of central sharpness. Moving on to the 16mm mark now, and you can see again in the middle, pretty good, wide open. Obviously the aperture has dropped, we're down to f5 now. Not a huge difference stopping that down in the middle, perhaps a slight improvement. And this time when we look in the corners, they're not too bad really, even at f5. And you'll notice they start to pick up. f8 and perhaps f11 would be the optimal aperture for this focal length. So you don't need to stop the lens down as dramatically as you do at 12mm. Once you get to 24mm, in the middle again, resolution pretty good, wide open, slight improvement stopping down, although the difference isn't particularly obvious. Once we start looking into the corners, they're not too bad at f5, 6, and again, stop it down to f8 and we get pretty good resolution across the frame. The takeaway from this is that you do need to stop the lens down heavily if you're using it in the 12 to 15mm, and I'll give you another practical example now. I am focusing on the gate in the front, f13, you can see on the side there's still a bit of softness there, also a bit of chromatic aberration, bit of purple and green fringing. That is relatively easy to clean up in software, that's not a particular problem, but it is present across the focal range, but only really in the outer regions. Doesn't make any difference though if you stop it down, it doesn't go away. Onto the lens flare now. You'll notice that there are some flare spots on this, and even stopping down you don't really get much of a sun star. I don't find the flare performance to be that bad really, although if you do catch it at the wrong angle, such as this shot here which I'll show you now, then it will wash things out a little bit in terms of the contrast. In case you're interested in the rendering, and I'm not sure too many people will be, but I thought I'd cover it anyway. It's pretty decent at most distances. You can see the background blur. You're only going to get a bit of background blur if you're quite close to a subject. And it's not a fast aperture lens, so it's probably not going to be a factor for most people, but I thought I would show a few samples to you just so you can get an idea of what to expect. It's mostly pretty smooth, but there are a few times when it can get a little bit edgy, such as the sample that I'm going to show you now. A bit of outlining on that. Whilst I show you a few samples, different images that I've taken with this lens, I'll give you a few of my thoughts. Firstly, it's not just limited to landscape photography. People tend to think with ultra-wide angles that that's their first primary use. A lens like this, because it's not that fast, you could use it for interior photography or real estate. But there is one thing that I would say, I honestly don't think that you need a 12mm ultra-wide angle lens for interior photography. I can't think of too many times that I've needed anything wider than say something like a 16 or 17mm. As far as how wide do you need, it really depends on what you want to do. For some people a 20mm lens for example would be plenty wide enough. Others would be happy with a 15 or 16. That 12mm is very interesting, it can be quite fun. But it's not necessarily a particularly good choice for some landscape photography. It's not that easy to use an ultra wide angle lens. And there are also times where the top of the zoom range, 24mm, is still a bit too wide. So as useful as a lens could be, I wouldn't want to have it as the only lens in the bag as such. There is certainly an argument for landscape photography that you can use sort of short or even medium telephoto lenses as well. But much of that will depend on the type of composition that you're doing. I'll briefly talk about the performance because I've sort of covered the other areas. The lens never really quite gets there in the corners, even fully stopped down when you're at 12 to 15mm. Once you take it up to 16mm and over, it does get quite good across most of the frame when you've stopped the lens down. There's an obvious drop in quality at the widest part of the lens, which isn't that surprising really. It does cover a very wide field of view. Depending on what sort of price you find for this lens, I think it's an interesting choice. It could be worth a look, but do bear in mind the pros and cons of this particular model. That's pretty much it from me on this one, so thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.